A big theme for the nervous system is protection. And why, again, do we need to protect our neurons? Well, neurons are delicate. Neurons are post-mitotic, so if they hurt themselves and they die, we can't replace them. And so our body will spend a lot of energy protecting our neurons. We protect them with bones, like our skull and our vertebrae. We protect them with layers called meninges that are in between the skull and our brain. And we also bathe the whole thing in fluid so that it kind of rests in a bowl as opposed to hitting bone when it moves. So our meninges cover our central nervous system. So this is showing our brain here, and we've got the dural matter, the arachnoid matter, and the pia matter that are in between the skin of our scalp, the bone, and then we have our meninges and our brain. And the CSF, again, acts as a cushion, and it's continually made from blood by our choroid plexuses in the roof of our ventricles, and it will circulate through those ventricles and down into the spinal cord. This is a lateral view of our ventricles. Again, there are giant holes in your brain, just full of fluid. And so that fluid, again, will be made and will then circulate around the brain, and some of it will enter into the central canal of the spinal cord. The ultimate gatekeeper is our blood-brain barrier. So this is the separation between our central nervous system and our body. And it's formed with capillaries that have very, very tight junctions that only allow very small things like water, glucose, and amino acids. Things that are fat soluble can also diffuse easily, but a lot of large molecules will be stuck in the blood vessel and not make it into the brain tissue. This is part of the reason why it's very hard to design drugs that impact the brain and can help with things like mental illness or neurodegenerative diseases. And that's because it's really hard to get drugs past that blood-brain barrier and actually get them to our central nervous system. So think about ways that we can protect our nervous system and why it's so important. Let's now talk about some dysfunctions that can arise, again, in part because these neurons are post-mitotic. So what if you do injure them? Well, a common one is a traumatic brain injury, or a TBI. And this can result in a concussion, which is a loss of consciousness, or a contusion, which is like a brain bruise. It can also lead to intracranial hemorrhaging, which is bleeding in the brain. Again, you've burst through that blood-brain barrier, and blood is now filling your brain. Or in even more severe circumstances, you can get cerebral edema, which is where the brain actually starts to swell. And the pressure can be so bad that they actually have to drill a hole in your skull to relieve the pressure because the brain is, again, in that enclosed space. Strokes are also bad. So strokes are the third leading cause of death in the United States. They can sometimes be referred to as CVAs, or cerebrovascular accidents. And this is caused by a transient ischemic attack where we have a clot that travels to your brain and bursts through, in most cases, will burst through the blood vessels. In less severe strokes, the blood vessel doesn't burst all the way, but it is still clogged. And that is going to very quickly lead to issues because your brain needs a constant supply of oxygen brought to it through the blood vessel system. Depending on where that blood clot occurs and the damage occurs, that will determine the side effects that the person experiences. So if it hits a motor area, they can have paralysis. It may just be hemiparalysis or hemiplegia, which is paralysis on one half of the body. And that's because our cerebral hemispheres control the motor output for one half of the body on one side of your brain. So the left side of your brain controls the motor output on the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the motor output on your left side of your body. So if you get a blood clot in your motor cortex on the left side of your brain, the right side of your body will go completely numb or be unable to move. So that's a hemiplegia. Now, as we talked about with Broca-Wernicke's area in class, you can also get an aphasia or a language deficit, depending exactly on where the blood clot is. So with strokes, the clot location will determine the extent of the symptoms. Let's end our central nervous system part by talking about the spinal cord. It is the information highway. So it is about 17 inches long, and it goes from our skull to our lumbar spine, and it's also covered with meninges. It will shoot out 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and the very end is called the quadrae equina, which comes from horse or horseback riding. If you've ever ridden a horse and you've gotten muscle soreness on the inside of your legs, that's because the quadrae equina nerves innervate or turn on those inner thigh muscles. So this is showing you, again, the spinal nerves. And all I want you to know is that the spinal nerves are named. Well, I want you to know the number of spinal nerves that we have, 31 pairs, and that they're named for the area that they exit the spine. So we have cervical spinal nerves that exit in the cervical vertebrae, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And we have bulges or enlargements that occur for our limbs. So our arms have nerves that come out of that cervical enlargement, and our legs have nerves that come out of the lumbar enlargement. And our spinal cord has separated motor and sensory input. So there are two horns of our spinal cord. The dorsal horn has our sensory input, and the ventral horn has our motor input. And as those nerves leave the spinal cord, they will then fuse and come together, and we'll have the sensory and motor information in our spinal nerves travel together when they leave the spinal cord. But in the spinal cord, they're separate. And again, this is showing you the motor and the sensory input is kept separate, and then they will come together and form spinal nerves as they exit the spinal cord. The spinal cord white matter is made of different fiber tracts. Again, we have the sensory afferent tract or the motor efferent tract. And this is why with spinal cord injuries, depending on where the injury occurs in the spinal cord, if it just damages one or the other horn, you might have motor function intact but no sensory function, or vice versa. So this is showing you the flow of information again. The sensory information will come up, and then it will travel up the spinal cord. It'll cross over and head into the brain, and will pass through the thalamus as a relay station. The cerebral cortex will make some sort of integration and response and send that down, where it will cross and then enter the spinal cord and leave in an efferent nerve. In the next video, we'll discuss our peripheral nervous system.